Dear community, part of Audre Lorde's and Pat Parker's work as Black feminist critical social theorists was their advocacy for women's and queer health justice. As health educators, they insisted on collaborative knowledge production. Their writings demonstrate how dialogue, talking, sharing, reaching toward, being with, making use, as Patricia Hill Collins put it, the re-articulation of everyday taken for granted knowledge, how dialogue leads to individual and group empowerment. As Lorde wrote to Parker, whatever I have, know that is useful to you is yours. And Parker to Lorde, this is not a piece of paper, but my arm extending across all the damn miles between us to hold you. It's Parker's health activism that I want to share about because some of you may not know as much about it. I put together this narrative mostly through dialogues, and I want to thank Jose Alfresco, Blackberry, Lindsay Comey, Judy Grahn, Alicia Jones, and Lisa Moore for having conversations with me. Parker centered group knowledge production and community empowerment through her work in the feminist self-help movement. By self-help, I don't mean the neoliberal ideology that promises self-actualization through individual consumer choices. Rather, I mean the radical DIY movement that grew out of civil rights, Black power, and women's liberation. Among other things, feminist self-helpers taught lay people gynecology and holistic abortion care and were early advocates for reproductive justice. Along with Billie Avery, Dazon Dixon Diallo, Lorde, Loretta Ross, Beverly Smith, Evelyn White, and others, Parker helped catalyze a Black women's health movement in tandem with gynecological self-help. In Avery's words, Black feminist self-help forwarded, quote, talking as an ongoing process, and imagined women's health as encompassing not only reproductive, but cancer, HIV/AIDS, addiction, and mental health care. Parker joined the lay people-run Oakland Feminist Women's Health Center in 1977 and quickly became a director. She worked with a multiracial group of mostly working class people, serving a diverse and underserved population until 1987. Parker insisted on a gender-inclusive space where no one anti-oppression struggle was put before another. Lisa Moore, a clinic worker in the early 80s, recalls, in other spaces it was maybe feminist but super white, or a POC space but not feminist or queer. At the health center, the liberation of working class people was important. The liberation of people of color was important. I'm going to give that to Pat. It was never a question of having to choose. Parker was an active health educator and defender in her community. At the first Black Lesbian Conference in 1980, held at the Women's Building, she led a workshop on health issues and Black lesbians with a focus on the injustice of institutionalized experimentation, as she phrased it. In the mid-80s, when the New Right and Operation Rescue waged a terroristic anti-abortion campaign against abortion clinics, health workers, and people seeking abortion care, Parker helped form a clinic defense committee. And I think Steve's going to share a poster for a 1985 rally organized by the Clinic Defense Committee. Parker called for an end to forced sterilizations and spoke publicly about why legal abortion access and reproductive freedom are critical to the survival of poor women and women of color. In 1989, a month before the Supreme Court's ruling on Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, Parker told the Bay Guardian, quote, I tend to come from a little more radical perspective than many of the people in the pro-choice movement. I say a woman can have an abortion on demand, and if she wants to use abortion as birth control, that's her right too. She articulated how the anti-abortion movement was the theocratic right's attempt to, in her words, get women out of the workplace, back in the kitchens, and back in the nuclear family, subservient to men in a patriarchal society. 3 years prior, in February 1986, Parker read with Lorde at the Women's Building. The first poem Parker read that night was Maybe I Should Have Been a Teacher, which we heard earlier. She prefaced it by saying that there were a couple of references that she should, quote, clear up. Parker explained, there's an area of the poem where I talk about a woman being pregnant in her stomach. And after reading this poem several times, I found out that many of us still believe that women get pregnant in their stomachs from the days when our mothers said, there's a baby in my tummy. We don't get pregnant in our stomachs if we can help it. The audience laughed, and then Parker added, in all seriousness, that's why we have uteri. In fact, she was referring to an actual case of abdominal pregnancy that she saw at the health center. In this case, the embryo or fetus grows outside of the uterus and attaches to a fallopian tube, bowel, or other organ. While in lyricist mode, Parker continued to wear her health educator hat. The inverse was also often true. In the final stanza of her poem titled Love Isn't, first drafted in 1982, it appears in Jonestown, Parker writes, "All I can give is my love. I care for you. I care for our world. If I stop caring about one, it would only be a matter of time before I stop loving the other." A loving commitment to community and liberation struggles, Parker suggests, is sustained through queer intimacy and a resistant relationship to the closed heterocentric family unit. And queer intimacy is nurtured by one's commitment to community and liberation. In this sense, revolution is not an event on the distant or even not so distant horizon, but rather engaged everyday praxis. Love, Angela. Thank you.